Thank you all. Thank you all for being part of what I can see is an absolutely amazing school. When I first came in the door, I arrived a little bit early, took the train up from Washington, and came up to the fifth floor, knocked on the door. A student was right behind the door, opened it up and said, "Oh, come on in." And then there was nobody else around. I went into the kitchen, put my things down, looked around, and then I saw the things on the wall. And right away, I felt at home, because I know what you're about, at least to a degree, on a foundational level. You have a commitment, I'll say, to the human person. And you have a commitment in a humble way to understanding what it is to see. And you have a commitment to developing your skills, however far those skills might develop. But I will probably note a little more in depth later on that skill is not everything, nor is it just an end in itself. And that's my personal opinion. And then, speaking of personal opinions, I want to give you a little bit of a background, maybe an explanation for language that I might use. I think everyone speaks from a point of view, and we have to, when we listen and try to understand what another is saying, we have to take some time and do a little bit of translating. Well, the translating is not going to be too difficult for you, but a lot of it will come from my background as a Roman Catholic. So there's certain language that I'll use that may be perplexing to those of you who are not Catholic or not Christian or have no familiarity with it. So if there's any confusion, please, when we get into the Q&A period, please do ask me to clarify things. But that's the point of view that I come from. A lot of things are implied in that as well. You see some of my religious emblems. I'm what's called a lay Dominican. And there's a real commitment to the teachings of Thomas Aquinas and therefore Aristotle before him. And I find that those things tie in very closely to someone being a realist artist, whether you know it consciously or not. Now, I am not an academic. I have appreciation for philosophy, but a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I have a few ideas, things that I've lectured on in the past relating to art and aesthetics. And I put together a set of notes that I'd like to actually pass to you so that you can have something in front of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
It'll take just a few minutes to go through some terms.
How much is it?
And while preparing for that, I want to also express deep gratitude to Dan Thompson for inviting me, for my longtime friend, Mr. Perkins, who I think suggested the idea, and again, just to all of you for making this what I can see immediately as an amazing place. So the title of this talk is Figurative Art and Transformation. That relates to a lecture that I gave 32 years ago at the University of San Francisco, which I called Figurative Art and the Human Spirit. And in that lecture, I proposed an idea that modernism was dead or dying, and that a new role of art in human life was emerging, which I called art as a vehicle for personal and social transformation. Why did I say modernism was dead and dying? Because by the mid-70s, about the time that Tom Wolfe published this wonderful painted word book. The movements of modernism were just spinning out of control. And already people who questioned that began returning to realism. The question is why? Expression theory, I'm just going to go through some of these points, but not in depth, because I'll refer to some of this language later. Expression theory is the foundation of modern art. It's that the idea is more important than the work of art itself. And in the early 20th century, classical and avant-garde modernism, I call these branches of modernism. One you could say would be typified by the sculptor Henry Moore, the painter Matisse. The other, the avant-garde, would be typified by people like Robert Rauschenberg or Joseph Beuys, or people who were doing things that would be considered shocking. But by the 1980s, even a book written by a great Australian art critic called The Shock of the New outlined that this could not continue. So what are the historical and universal roles of art in human life? There are many things that art has done in different cultures at different times in history, but many of these things are universal. Art tells a story, that's illustration. Art has been used for religious purposes from the beginning times of religion, to be either ceremonial part of the religious act or to tell the religious story. Art has been in the very fundamental role of exploring who we are, that big question, who am I? Why am I here? And that is not new. Many of you know that the oldest portrait that we have, the woman of Brasempoi, is about 25,000 years old, carved out of the tusk of a woolly mammoth. So that fundamental exploration of who am I is at the heart of portraiture. So art has been decoration, art has been imitation, many roles, but the primary role in the 20th century was art as expression, or often called self-expression. But I just saw that coming to an end. And 2 years after that lecture, I witnessed something that I thought was confirming of that, and that was the creation of this large, ad hoc, rough statue, vaguely resembling our Statue of Liberty, in Tiananmen Square in Beijing during the democracy demonstrations. We don't have any individual artist or act of self-expression in that. That was a statue which was meant to be a means or a vehicle for the student movement to save face and exit the square. Unfortunately, they are already surrounded by the People's Liberation Army, and we know what happened. So I posited a new role of art in human life. What is transformation? Well, in the 1980s, there was a popular movement called transpersonal psychology. Transformation holds really that we have free will, that we're not locked into a deterministic view of our nature, that we can change. What I call the age of subjectivism was, it's hard to pinpoint the dates of that, but the dominance of the idea that reality is in our minds only, and that it's not the Aristotelian view that it is separate from our consciousness. Now, I know this is a pluralistic group. I don't expect you always to agree with what I say, but I do take the Aristotelian premise. So in 20th century art, with except for a few courageous bridges and threads from 19th and early 20th century realism passing through the century, we had this huge amount of art movements that were always focusing on the self, on self-expression. But there is something interesting that we, I'm sure, all experience. There's a certain contrarian spirit to just being an artist. I mean, your great Philadelphia artist, Robert Henry, in his book, The Art Spirit. There's something about us where we want to not just repeat, but do something fresh. Unfortunately, when it's only the idea itself to be fresh, like art theory that does not satisfy. So we need to learn the skill to truly do something fresh. So then I said, representation of experience. What drives a realist? This is a fundamental, you might say, phenomenological approach. What is before my eyes? What is my visual experience? And how do I recreate that? Or how do I record that? We all know that's not easy. And you go through those actions to increase your skills, but you're not just increasing your motor skills. You're increasing your abilities to see. And it can be repeated again and again and again, and it's never quite the same way. We seek to record or recreate that visual field, that visual experience, and we can never run out of fresh ideas there. I see in this wonderful environment many portraits, and I think the portrait is especially fundamental here. Portraiture goes right to the heart of this human experience of, it's called the phenomenal self, I like to call it the human spirit, but the experience of one's own being alive, right? This very moment, each of you is in a unique point of view in this room. You look out upon the room, you see and hear me. I can't see myself, I can only see my own hands, I can see the side of my nose. Each of us has that, but when we ponder it, it can be a little scary because that leads us to the questions of, the deepest questions of life, about our mortality, why are we here, and so on. The portrait has this unique capacity to bring us to that experience. And I'm sure, there were models here when I came today, that models are in a rather unique position when people are observing them, and then the viewer of the finished work of art is in a unique position, and of course the artist is. And we're all participating in that exploration of meaning of the human spirit. So, in conclusion, the portrait can, I like to say, embody that experience, and if it's done well, bring the viewer to that experience. That's transformation. What is the value of that? There was a great book written by a Jewish theologian, Martin Buber, popular in the 1970s, called I and Thou. And it is to have the recognition that the other has an experience just like yours. But we must empathize with that. And in my opinion, that can lead to, honestly, it can lead to peace. It leads us to respect that unique personhood of each human being. Okay. Now, I would like to take a little bit of time and take some of these terms and apply them to some projects that I've been very blessed to be able to do over the years. So could we have the first slide, please? Sometimes I like to think of this as the last nude sculpture ever put in place, public sculpture in California. And that was in 1977 on the campus of Cal State Long Beach, where I got my MFA degree. Cal State Long Beach, when I first encountered it, was a Renaissance center. It had many figure modeling classes in the sculpture department. You could learn bronze casting and stone carving. And this was 1974, when people were doing body mutilation as part of an avant-garde type of art. So when I first discovered it, I thought, oh, this place is too good to be true. And I have to say, when I walked in your door, it reminded me of my first experience at Cal State Long Beach. But it was true. It was a place where, in the depths of the avant-garde dominating the art world, I could study classical realism. And the dean of the graduate school very graciously accepted that to be a public sculpture on the campus of Cal State Long Beach. The next slide. Another single standing figure lots of anatomy, but a swimsuit. This was a commission. This was a competition that I won in 1989 for the city of Santa Cruz, California, to make a monument to surfing. Now, I have never done any surfing except body surfing. I did get bounced around by waves quite a few times, but I never really stood up on a surfboard. I tried it once in Hawaii, and finally it dawned on me why all the rental surfboards were still in their racks and nobody was out surfing. There weren't any waves. But I was fortunate to have as a collaborator in this project, the fellow who made the pedestal, a true Santa Cruz surfer. And he called me one day, and he was my former student from Cal State Long Beach, and said, I think there's a competition. If you'll collaborate with me and do the figure, I think we can make something happen here. And we did. We won the competition. He did the pedestal, and two of the original members of the 1936 Santa Cruz Surf Club shaped a redwood board, which we had cast in bronze. It's a very simple concept, and it was taken from a postcard which showed how surfer teenagers always stood when somebody asked them to take a picture. They would stand up straight, put their board behind them, and hold it. That is the famous Santa Cruz Boardwalk, the amusement park in the background. Next slide, please. But this is a portrait. And it was meant to be both a portrait that said this is a human individual, this is a particular person, but with universal appeal. How are you going to make universal appeal? Every portrait is going to be unique. It's either going to be a man or a woman. It's either going to be someone old or someone young or someone in between. It's either going to be someone physically fit or not, or some combination thereof. It's always going to be a particular person. But I tried in this to bring some universal qualities to it, of expectation, of potential for athletic motion and things like that. It has been very favorably received. It's been up for 27 years now. Next slide, please. In 1989, also, after getting that commission to do the surfer, so I'm working on that project during these years, and I was living in San Francisco, in the city. I lived there from 1978 to 1997, and my wife and I then moved up to the wine country of Sonoma for another 9 years. In 1989, some of you will remember, there was a huge demonstration for democracy in a very brutal communist country, China. And at one point, 1 million students were in Tiananmen Square. Ironically, that name means the gate of heavenly peace. Immediately after the massacre, like many sculptors around the world, said, you can't do this because sculptors will rebuild it. All we need are a few photographs. And I was very fortunate to receive some photos of the original in the Central Academy of Art in Beijing. So that's a rare image. You can see how big it is. It was done in styrofoam and then wrapped together with plaster-soaked rags. There are many times in news articles you'll see approximations of how it was made, or many times mistaken. This is how it was made. Styrofoam blocks, plaster-soaked rags, and then direct plaster, some direct plaster sculpting on the surface. Next slide, please. This is what it looked like in Tiananmen Square. And the students had hoped that this would be a means, as I said, to save face and exit the square. Next slide, please. This next one will give you a little perspective on it, but there were approximately at one point, maybe not in this particular photo, but this, the crowd spread way beyond this. As I said, about 1 million people. Tiananmen Square is the largest public square in the world at 99 acres. And the great juxtaposition, if you look closely, in front of the statue, which became known as the goddess of democracy, is the statue of Mao Zedong. Now, however you have personal opinions about political things, the fact remains that communist governments in the history of the 20th century are responsible for about the deaths of 100 million people, and most of which were done in starvation campaigns by Mao Zedong. Next slide, please. So my motivation was to recreate this, and I led the project in San Francisco to make a smaller version. It's a 1/4 scale version. It's still an 8-foot figure, 10 feet to the top of the torch, to become a public bronze sculpture in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown. That project itself, in the bureaucracy of San Francisco, took 5 years. The statue was done in 3 months. A lot of stories behind that one, let me tell you. I will tell you one. Many factions were involved, let's say political factions. The overwhelming majority of San Franciscans, and by incidentally, you may not know this, but San Francisco is approximately 1/3 Chinese, either immigrants or Chinese Americans. And there was a lot of passion about this project. The vast majority supported it. But in City Hall and the Parks and Rec Department and things like that, there were very, I'll say, sneaky and deceitful political maneuvers to try to block the project. Once we got through all those hurdles, there was one last question. What's going to go on the plaque? And now I knew some of the players in the Park and Rec Department who were going to have the ultimate decision-making authority to say what's on the plaque. You may think that's a small thing, but that's a very big thing, what's on the plaque. So I decided, as the designer of the plaque also, to write in Chinese. I do speak Mandarin, but my reading and writing is abysmal, is minimal. But at that time, I wrote, dedicated June 4th, 1994. And everything was in English and in Chinese, except I left it off in English, taking the gamble that no one in the Park and Rec Department would be able to read it. And they didn't, and it passed. So every person who can read Chinese who goes there knows. June 4th. That's a date that is like July 4th, or is like June 14th, or, big date in history, June 4th. And one last point, I did 95% of the modeling on this. One of my motivations in supporting the democracy movement in China was very personal. My dearest graduate student, rest in peace, he died 3 years ago, 22 years older than me, fabulous sculptor, was a political prisoner for 11 years. A year and a half of that was in solitary confinement. I invited him to do the features on the face. So that is not by my hand, the face. Everything else is. Next slide, please. So there have been some spin-offs from this. In Washington, D.C., if you look closely over at the right, there's the Capitol. This is a project I had both as concept designer of the architectural, landscape architecture, and the statue to do the Victims of Communism Memorial. It was dedicated in 2007. President Bush was there and dedicated the statue. And it is very solemn on this stark granite base. And it really got panned by the architecture critic, the art critic and architecture critic of the Washington Post. And I guess a bad review is better than no review. every year on June 12th, which is, or on or about June 12th, which was the anniversary of the Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall speech in Berlin. There is a wreath-laying ceremony of all the nations, or people representing all the nations who have ever suffered under or still suffer under communism. So this is not just a work of self-expression. What is the art in this? When I did the one in San Francisco, a wonderful former teacher of mine, you might know this name, Stephen Werlick, W-E-R-L-I-C-K, fabulous sculptor. I lamented a little bit. I said, well, it's not my work. He said, of course it's your work. Just because you didn't originate the image, you did this sculpture, or 95% of it. So I think this is not my self-expression. I made a recreation, in a way, of a recreation of the original. And I did more universal features on the face. So this is all by my hand. Next slide, please. And that image has continued to reverberate. Just a couple of weeks ago, you may not recognize him now, but the man in the white hair is Lech Walesa, who founded the Polish Solidarity Union, and he was given the award. That's a woodcut that I did. I still do some two-dimensional work, and of containing that image. And it was very moving to hear him speak. Those of you who are very young, you may not know, but in the 1980s, he defied the Polish communist government to start a labor union in Poland, which were against the law. Next slide, please. So moving on to a different work, but a work that still involves the idea of transformation, of being able to be aware of something that you didn't see before. This is my version of John the Baptist at Mission San Juan Bautista, the mission of John the Baptist, in California. It's about 50 miles south of San Jose, so about 100 miles south of San Francisco. And I was asked to create a John the Baptist that had a very particular position and role. Now this is all going to relate to something that maybe those who are familiar with the Catholic faith will really understand. But if you have nothing to do with Catholicism, I think you still might find this interesting. Because, if you could, the next slide please. When this church was designed, which went from 1797 to 1813, when it was dedicated, the person or people who designed it made that solitary window on the front of it. It's kind of rare. But the priest at the time when I met him in the mid-90s observed one day when he opened the doors of the church at around Christmas time that he was blinded by the light reflecting off the shining tile floor. And he turned around and he looked back, and a beam of light was resting right on the center of what is called the tabernacle on the altar. The Catholics, you'll understand how significant that is. That means that the designer of the mission, and that was the very moment that the sun rose on the winter solstice. The sun just kind of peeks over the mountaintop in the east, and the light shines right on the tabernacle. Okay, that is not something that happens just by chance, by accident. Next slide, please. This is a slide taken a little after sunrise, but you can see how the shadow of John the Baptist there, you can imagine if you could shift the sun a little bit and change the shadow, that those arms or hands could be positioned, the shadows that is, right over the center of the door. So the idea that the priest asked me to put in place was that if you stood in the doorway of the church at the moment of the sunrise on the winter solstice, it would look as if John is holding the sun in his hands. It wasn't easy to make that happen, let me tell you. First of all, because every December 21st in San Juan Bautista, California is not a sunny day. But 2 years in a row was all we needed. I will call that God's providence. A year prior to the dedication of the statue, which was dedicated December 21st in the year 2000, 1999 now, I was standing up on a stepladder. My wife was back in the doorway of the church, and with my hands just at the right height, she took the picture to secure the idea of where that statue had to be. I went and pounded a stake in the ground, and then a year later we dedicated that statue. Next slide, please. One more, please. So this is another view looking out toward what is the San Andreas Fault. I was in San Francisco in 1989 also. Another great event happened. Referring to Tiananmen Square as a great event, great in the sense of horrific, but so was this great event of October 17th, 1989. An earthquake. I was used to earthquakes, living there for so many years, but nothing ever like this one. This was a 7.1. And I always described it as feeling like if you were at the very back of the jumbo jet, which we used to call jumbo jets, in major turbulence where you can't stand up, that's what it felt like. Anyway, along those grassy areas, that's the San Andreas Fault, and yet the mission has never suffered major damage in all those earthquakes. If you look at the base, you'll see relief sculptures. Next slide, please. These are symbols of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you look at the horizontal surface, look closely, there's a honeycomb with dripping honey and a locust. And in the Bible, John ate locusts and wild honey. There's no title or description on this sculpture, only the references to the Bible. And the one on the front, this is going to tie in one more time to the sun, is a reference in the book of Luke, where John's father, a priest named Zechariah, said, "You, my child, shall be the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his way, to give his people knowledge of salvation by the forgiveness of their sins. In the tender compassion of our God, the dawn from on high shall break upon us." And that's often Christ, the sun will symbolize Christ. So that's the tie-in to the sun and John the Baptist and the phenomenon there. And I'll close this little segment by saying, whoever designed that church was doing conceptual art before they had any idea what that would be called. Next slide, please. And this is a close-up of one of the reliefs. I want to add, very importantly, that the priest asked me to make very deliberate references to American Indian symbology and design motifs, which I did. Now, whatever opinions you have about the California missions and the Indian tribes, the Native Americans, it is a fact that it was an important and significant event in the history of Native Americans, the founding of the California missions, whether you view that positively or negatively. I will say that particular tribe called the Mutsun around San Juan Bautista were very happy to have the mission there, because the Pawnee from up the mountainside toward Lake Tahoe would come down and periodically massacre them. So this was something that the Mutsun liked. They were protected by a wall, and but you know, those are discussions that could go on and on. I only want to say that my motivation in this was to honor the role that Native Americans played in the mission. So it's a very deliberate stylistic reference to Native American motifs. That was one of their sacred symbols, by the way, the golden eagle. Next slide, please. This is another religious work. Of course, not all the works I'm going to show are religious, but they have meaning beyond self-expression. That's why I'm showing these. That the context of the work goes way beyond what I am as a person. I'm trying to do the best I can with my skills to make works of art which are say, a structure that relates to bigger ideas. This is a larger-than-life figure of Saint Joseph, the biblical foster father of Jesus. So you can see how big it is in relation to a standing person. Next slide, please. And I don't know, say that there are people of various ages in here, but I'll say personally, in my wife's and my experience, if you've ever lost a child, especially through miscarriage, no one is going to have to tell you how heartbreaking and difficult that is. And then on the issue, the big question where there's lots of debate on abortion, there are many women who have had abortions who grieve over that. So if a woman who had an abortion or a miscarriage is grieving this loss, can I have the next slide, please? This is St. Joseph cradling a 6-month preborn. And the next slide, please. And it's also a landscape architectural shrine. It's basically a prayer shrine. And women who have lost a baby in this way are invited to name it, and the names fill the stones that are added to this set of circular curves. And there's definitely a reference to the idea of Moses in this, if you want to think about further biblical references. And by the way, the lilies are planted there, and that's the symbolic flower of St. Joseph. That's in Santa Cruz, right across the street from the surfer. Next slide, please. And I thought you might like to see a quote-unquote traditional crucifix in Catholic churches. That's a significant element in not only the ecclesiastical setting, but it's also of the liturgy. That's in a city called Madera, California. But I'd like to show you in the next slide. You can see how this figure is in a vast space. It was a church built about 1960, and it had modernist mosaics in it. And the priest in 2003 asked me to make a realistic sculpture of the moment where Christ is still living, just before he expires on the cross. Next slide, please. And this is another when I say interactive work, landscape architecture. I was given the pathway, just as a pathway, landscape architecture design that, and then I designed the alcoves and these structures that are scenes from the life of St. Joseph in the Bible. Next slide, please. And there is Joseph at the moment when he has learned that Mary is pregnant, and the religious order called the Oblates of St. Joseph called it the first sorrow of St. Joseph. And that's fairly low relief. It's only about an inch. These an inch deep. These are 16 by 20 inch, so this is a little deceptive. It's a much smaller sculpture than that. Next slide, please. Joseph contemplating where Mary is going to bear the child Jesus. Had a lot of fun with those animals, by the way. Once again, that's all bas relief. Nice, if those of you who are interested in sculpture, once you get the forms, then texture can be just an absolute delightful thing to have almost an orchestration or a juxtaposition of many different textures. Next slide, please. And again, I'm going to refer to those of you who are parents. If you, and I know you've all had this experience, having a 2-year-old or so, 3-year-old, 12-year-old, maybe a 3-year-old at the mall, the shopping center, and you turn around and they're gone. Well, that was the situation when Jesus was 12 and they were in a caravan, and Mary and Joseph turned around and Jesus was gone. So I tried to show that kind of, that frenzy, panic that a parent feels when a child is missing. Okay, next slide, please. This is the beginning of that work that was referred to at St. Mary's in Fredericksburg. I just thought those of you who are sculptors would like to see a clay statue in progress. The fabric is just the moist sheets that keep the clay from cracking. Next slide, please. And you don't have to, if you're going to make a rubber mold, cover everything in rubber. If there is a part of the statue that is sufficiently without undercut, you can just make a direct plaster piece. So many times on big pieces, I'll make partial rubber molds and partial plaster molds. And then the rubber is backed up with plaster. Next slide, please. That was 10 years ago. So you can see how I've aged. Lots of technical stuff, and I was just strapping this up so I could hoist it up a little higher. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And this is a material which is called fiberglass reinforced gypsum cement. The technical trade name is FGR 95. And you can create, this is a 6'6" figure, head to toe, weighed 90 pounds, completely permanent, it's as strong as ceramic. So if you're interested in sculpture technical things, part of the Q&A, please ask me questions. It is a great interior sculpture material. Next slide, please. Another view. That is on the far right, St. Michael ready to decapitate the snake. Next slide, please. Now that's super large, I know, but I just want you to see that things can be loose and colorful in sculpture. Next slide, please. And that was before the casting. Next slide, please. So that previous slide of the head of the crucifix, head of Christ, I did as a portrait. So we don't have any reference other than, if you believe this as I do, the Shroud of Turin. But I try to create a portrait of Christ. That's something we can do as artists, is create portraits from our imagination. But then, as you do here from models, you're encountering a real living human being. This was a portrait I did of one of my models at the Art Academy in San Francisco, who modeled there from the late 1940s until she was in her late, like my age. She modeled until then. And that was, she stopped modeling in the late 80s. Her name is Virginia Neal, one of the most amazing people I ever met. Next slide, please. This was another one of the most amazing people I ever met when I lived first time in Italy in the late 70s. This is the man who taught me to speak Italian, and he was illiterate. So years ago, I was quite, I'm still fluent, but I was almost bilingual. But people, Italian native speakers, would kind of laugh at me because I sounded funny. I suppose, I live near the Blue Ridge Mountains and the hollers and Appalachia. And I was supposed to be like someone from Appalachia teaching a foreigner to speak fluent English. That's kind of the way I spoke. And his name was Domenico. the salt of the earth. And why is portraiture this way? I tried to touch on that in the first discussion. We're encountering a human person just like us. To dwell in that point of view, I said, can be uncomfortable because many things, but it puts us in touch with our mortality. That's something that often people don't want to think about. But that experience of our personhood, the human spirit, we can empathize with that in the other during the creation of a portrait, but also if you do it well by viewing another's portrait. I find portraiture thus to be one of the most fundamental artistic acts. It's universal, and it has been from the dawn of history. And judging from what I see among you, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And I applaud you all. It brought such joy to my heart to come in and be brought through your studios where you were working from models. Are any of the models here tonight? I saw them. Thank you. God bless you. That is a noble profession, dramatically underpaid, and especially in today's world, which is so crass and can't understand the idea of mimicking art. I applaud you for being willing to do this because it is a treasure, not to be taken lightly. Next slide, please. Just some portraits. Skill and likeness, things, skill in representing the figure, that's important. But I referred earlier to what I was going to say. I don't think it's everything. And I think there's a danger. I saw this when I was looking years, I was in California, in San Francisco, but I saw the work done at the Graduate School of Figurative Art in New York, which I was very excited about when it came into existence. But I saw people look like they were trying to compete with who was going to be the hottest realist. And it bothered me because I think of artists who historically were realists, and kind of idiosyncratic artists like El Greco or Van Gogh, who worked out of such love and weren't trying to prove anything, just to continue to the next piece, to do the next work. So I want to say to those of you, and there's probably the majority in the room, if you feel frustrated that maybe sometimes, I don't feel good enough, or my skills aren't good enough, or I'm just getting started, what is this all about? Skill is important, but it's not everything. What is everything is the love in your work. Next slide, please. This was the great-grandfather of the next portrait that I'm going to show you. He was an oil man in Arkansas. Next slide, please. His grandson was my student and called me one day, and he had commissioned me to do his grandfather's portrait, and said, I'd like you to do a portrait of our daughter. She just died. She had that trisomy, and they said the best life they could for the months that she lived. And they asked me to do a portrait of her cradled by the hands of God to be her headstone cap. So it goes over a granite headstone. Next slide, please. Her name was Lily. Now that's in bronze now outside in the cemetery. That's a portrait. Next slide, please. Now, one more project that goes beyond any particular act of self-expression. Some of you will remember this image. That's the man who stood in front of a row of tanks in Tiananmen Square the day after the massacre. By the way, the best estimate, I'll tell you, is 10,000 people were killed. The news media tried to downplay that year after year, but British ambassador chronicled it the next day. It was 10,000. Next slide, please. So I was asked to create a portrait of that man. The only image we have is of his back. And I have to say that was a pretty decent sight to have an unveiling. And the man on the left is Dr. Yang Jianli. He's the head of really the China democracy movement today. Just spoke to him on the phone today. His organization called Initiatives for China has been very active in Hong Kong now too. And there are two major donors. One has been arrested. He's a businessman in Shanghai. And the other has to stop because all of his clients, he's in Hong Kong, but his clients are in mainland China. So if any of you know any well-heeled people who want to donate to the democracy movement in China, please contact me, okay? Because this is very urgent. And I must say that it was quite a thrill. The Speaker of the House was the other person who unveiled it there. If she looks familiar. She worked very hard, Speaker Pelosi, to help make the San Francisco project happen years ago. And don't assume anything about my politics by that. I'm very neutral on such things. She is an important government leader, and she has worked tirelessly for the democracy movement in China. Next slide, please. So that's a portrait. I was asked to do a portrait, except I didn't have a model except the view of the back of his head. So what I tried to do was take the image that I remember and partially of a portrait that I did of my old friend who died, who was the political prisoner, and youth him to make him appear as he would at about age 20 to 22. Next slide, please. And finally, this is what's going on right now. That's a pedestal waiting for a statue. And again, in my Catholic faith, this is a rosary prayer walk that is 75 feet long, 50 feet wide. Next slide, please. And those of you who know about the rosary, these are the mysteries of the rosary. And what I'm working on right now is the corpus that will go on in relief, a relief sculpture to go on the cross, the white cross, and 4 evangelist symbols to go in those holes that you see, and then the statue to go on the pedestal. Next slide, please. And that's the statue in gypsum cement. And it's Mary as Queen of Heaven and Christ as King of the universe. And the next slide, please. I think that's the last one, which I like to always say, that's the work in progress. And then we have to go on to the next one. For as much time as we have, it's always the next project. Thank you very much. I would love to entertain as many questions as you have, and I hope you can stick around for some Q&A. So please, yes?
What was the first Christ made out of, or cast out of?
That also was the FGR 95.
Okay.
And it's, the wooden cross was far heavier than the corpus.
And then it was just painted?
Yes, and you can paint this material. I like to use shellac a lot, and shellac has a color that's not unlike diluted burnt sienna. And those of you, I'm sure, have done, you do your grisaille, but some of you are getting into the earth tones. It's very similar to burnt sienna, and then it has a warm base, and you can go over it with cools in acrylics, and it works beautifully. And you can do an acrylic spray over the top. It is a marvelous interior material because it's strong, it's lightweight, and permanent, and you can paint it.
Is it solid?
No, it's very thin. It's like an eighth of an inch to 3/16 of an inch thick. It's fiberglass reinforced. Very similar to layup with polyester resin, except it's not toxic. I mean, it's dusty, but. No. Yes? Can I see another hand?
Were you just honored at the OAS, Organization of American States, recently?
I was not.
I thought you were. Okay, no. All right.
Yeah.
Maybe it was. Do you live in Washington?
I live 90 miles southwest of DC.
Okay.
Yes.
Could you go into a little more of the story about the Statue of Democracy in Tiananmen Square? Was it
Yes.
destroyed by the government? What
Yes.
happened to it?
That statue stood for, if you want to count the first day that it was unveiled, for 5 days. It was unveiled on our traditional Memorial Day, May 30th, 1989. Now already news reports, and I was in San Francisco, I wasn't there, news reports were that the troops and armored personnel carriers and troop transports were starting to surround the city and close in on the square. The massacre started just before midnight on June 3rd. And there are many eyewitness reports. You can Google the history of that, and keep in mind that there are those who want to downplay the severity of it. So you have to read it and judge for yourselves. But one interesting thing is that the students in the square, most of whom had not, I mean, they had not left, they were still in the square. But as the army started to close in through a large, wide avenue that there was an entrance to the square, citizens formed almost like barricades to keep them from coming in to kill their best and brightest. This was the hope, all of their hope right there. And, well, there were approximately 10,000 people who were killed. At sometime in the wee hours of the morning, when the massacre went through that time, it looked like a tank, or it could have been an armored personnel carrier. It was a tracked vehicle. This was broadcast into Hong Kong, which broadcast it to the world. Rode over a pile of debris and up against the tank and smashed it from behind, and it toppled over. And the head, you can see the head and everything smashing on the pavement. It's really ghost-like image, but that's what I saw broadcast. And my thought was, here is the dictatorial government wanting to send a message, but the result was the exact opposite. They thought they could destroy it, and many versions of it came back. After the so-called cleanup of the square, in the daylight of the next day, is when the tanks were patrolling the square, when the man came out and stood in front of the tank. I mean, if there's any specific question that I could answer on that, I would be happy to. I've gotten my information from people who were there.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
As you speak, I'm thinking about the symbolism of sculpture. I don't want to downplay painting, but
Right.
my wife tells me about the importance that the Khomeini regime had in destroying the statue of Reza Shah in Tehran, and thinking about the Saddam statue, and then the statue of Tiananmen Square. It's a curious thing, isn't it?
It is a very curious thing. The destruction of statuary, historical statuary, by contemporary sentiment, I find problematic unless it's at such an obvious extreme that there's no question about it. I mean, the Nazi statues or things like that, I mean, no one's going to try to defend that as a preservation of history. But I'll give you an example. In Virginia today, there has been and continues to be controversy about monuments to the Confederacy. And I'm not a Southerner by culture or by birth. brought my family there from California 13 years ago just because it was a pleasant, peaceful place to live. So I don't have any passion one way or the other about it, except that I don't like the idea of destroying historical statuary because it might give rise to uncomfortable or bad or negative feelings. Those are complicated things. They're not. I think they're more matters of degree than they are of kind. The Taliban in Afghanistan destroyed some Buddhist carvings which were carved into a mountainside. Very large stone carvings, kind of like not quite the size of Mount Rushmore carvings, but these were things that had been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they were dynamited. Certainly, a Buddhist sculptural image is not going to be something that could be anything other than just an ideological threat. And those are lost to us now. Now the question of statues of Stalin in Moscow, well, I would say yes, tear them down. I would equate that with Hitler. I would say tear down the statues of Mao when China becomes democratic. But some of you may disagree with that. It's more of a matter of degree than of kind, in my opinion. Yes?
When you're working on ideas for your sculpture, do you draw them or do you do small models? Especially when you're doing things that are not directly from life and you're trying to compose various things together like you did with many of your sculptures. How do you go about creating an idea?
Every situation is different, and many times there'll be drawings, start out with just pencil drawings, and sometimes a maquette. I'm not a sculptor who likes to do a piece of a certain size and then turn it over to a foundry and say, here, enlarge this. That runs against my grain. I don't like to work much bigger than life size. The 7 foot is about as big, or 8 foot figure is about as big as I've ever wanted to do, and that's about as big as one can handle on a stepladder. Okay, I like to be able to make it of human scale, maybe a little bigger or a little less.
But you don't do smaller versions first. You go from drawing directly to the original size.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. A little curious fact is for the John the Baptist, I made a maquette because I was going to need to show it to people who would be donors, potential donors to it. And when I was doing that, I was at a party, a woman looked at that and said, have you met my son? I said, no. And she happened to live nearby, went and got a photograph of him, and it was scary. I had basically created a sculpture of her son in this maquette, whom I later hired as the model for the statue. I'm here. I mean, I love to talk, I love to tell stories, but you got to prompt me here. Yes.
Okay, so when you're putting another Christ and the arms were done, and when you mold things in pieces, how
Yes.
do you join them together?
Oh,
and
great.
Make it seamless.
Great question. With that material, with that FGR95, first of all, I create on the inside something like that's that large, an inner structure, and I use copper tubing, and the various ways of joining it. Plumbing technology can be mechanical or it could be even sweat soldering. But that can be secured to one side of, say, the arm before sandwiching that together. And sometimes you have to get very creative at the end, so you have a little window that you reach in and put some fiberglass soaked Hydrocal, the FGR, just in the right place. It's kind of a weld. And that material joins together very well. it's if you've worked with Plaster, you can add to it, and you can then file it and rasp it, and you don't see anything but a continuous texture. There will be a little bit of a color change, but if you're going to be polychroming the sculpture, that doesn't matter.
And the dry time on it is?
It's quite fast, less than an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, I usually give it an hour, just to be sure. Mm.
I've got a
Yes,
question.
yeah,
So,
please.
this is a great city for sculpture.
Yes.
And I don't think many people realize that. I had to go meet Allison for a meeting the other day, and I almost wrecked my car. I was going around Philadelphia, and you encounter these things, and they're obviously from a certain era.
Yes.
So you just said it's not the degree of technical proficiency, it's the love in your work.
Mm.
But what do you think separates that, the caliber of work that one would see in Philadelphia sculpture circa 1901, 1910, 1890, that you're not seeing today in contemporary realist sculpture?
Well, there were more schools like yours back then, and the training was intense. It was highly disciplined, and praise to you for continuing and leading this. I mean, you're a diverse group of people. You come together because you share a common love here of that visual experience that you want to recreate. Now, when I said skill, when I was talking about skill, it is important. I'm just saying it's not everything. And sometimes I think if skill is viewed as the be-all and end-all, we end up with something like hyperrealism, which I find very unrealistic for other reasons. And I would agree when I took a taxi from the train station here, I was just in awe of how much public statuary there was here. I haven't been to Philadelphia since 1972 in the Greyhound bus station. and I didn't have a chance to look at it even now. I want to come back and spend some time. It's wonderful what I see. Yes, there'll be varying degrees of skill, and I might say, when I walked out of the, off the train, up the escalator, and then into the atrium of the 30th Street station to my left, it was just like, ha! This incredible sculpture, and I thought to my friends, could that be a late Sterling Calder? And then I went and I said, this is a World War II memorial. And I asked my friend Steve Perkins about it. He said, oh, that was my teacher. That's Walker Hancock. So, and that will lead me to one other thing I'd like to say. I think your connections to artists of the past are extremely important to have a kind of artistic genealogy. And I want to give you a little treat here. My graduate professor was a student of Rodin. So that makes all of you Rodin's artistic great-great-grandchildren. That's a fact. Okay. You can claim that genealogy. As long as you ask me a question. Anything else?
I do have another.
Yes.
Have you ever worked in wood?
Oh, I love to carve wood. The problem with wood, though, is that it's so labor intensive. You can speculate on a project and then have it sit in a gallery. A little discussion about galleries, but I love to carve wood, and I wish I could have. I mean, I've got a lot of pieces that I didn't show you here, but I love to carve wood. I love to carve wood, and my favorite is walnut.
Are most of your pieces commissioned?
They are now, yes.
They are now.
And I love doing commissioned work. And that's and that ties into why I am not so interested in self-expression. I'm interested in the interaction with a client and making an idea come into form, or helping to facilitate that. And as a religious man, I don't look at it as the self, it is God working through me.
Do you feel any pressure that this might not be the project to be proud of when it's a commissioned piece?
That's a good question, but you know what? I'm trying to think, have I ever experienced that kind of pressure? not in any significant way, not that I wasn't able to negotiate and say, look, what you're proposing is a bad idea, and here's why. But I've never really had to face sort of your money or your life situation. I did want to say something about galleries here. Maybe some of you have noticed this, but the gallery world seems to be dying. But take heart. The world of the internet can be a venue for you, especially in two-dimensional work. 3D work doesn't show up so well, I'm afraid, in digital formats. But I think there's a lot of potential, a whole world awaiting of economic opportunity for you via the internet. But I've seen a number of examples in the last 10 years of things really dying in the gallery world. So don't expect that to be your salvation. I mean, I'm sure there are going to be some exceptions, and maybe some of you are doing really well in galleries. But I think, and I'm all about people being able to live from their artwork, at least to a degree. And if you have enough financial support, another way to God bless you, to do it that way. But I think that commission work and sales that are done through the internet, I think, are very viable for the future. I'm not so sure about galleries now. Just in my experience. Yes. Oh, I thought you had a question. No.
No, you know, I feel that some of your subject matter was probably intensively heartbreaking for you, but you were able to overcome that and enjoy the joy of it, I guess, of the overall, what you were trying to say and what your client was asking you to say.
Like the little baby, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean.
And there was a personal relationship there too.
Yes,
So.
he was my student. This was his daughter.
Right.
What I can say about that is we all have our story. And you can't live a number of years without having triumph and tragedy.
Sure.
No, we all have our tragic stories, and I think many times that we as artists are best equipped to deal with that in relation to others. That it's a kind of strength that we have. We can steel ourselves, steel, against these emotional onslaughts while we're working. Maybe like if you're asked to give a eulogy for someone that you're close to, you have to steel yourself for a moment and do that. You still will feel, but there's a strength we have, and I think as artists we are given this capacity to have this emotional empathy with others and a sensitivity to many facets and levels of feeling, and I think we can use that to our advantage. Anyway, yes, I do think about that in a project like that very much.
Yeah, what Linda was talking about, what you kind of described and testified to is really interesting. I was on a panel with somebody who's a sculptor, and he's doing a topic. It's the Great War. And he downplayed his depth of engagement in it. He downplayed even an interest in it, but he was doing a major sculpture of it, and it just took me by surprise, and I left that situation wondering about how engaged with the subject and the commission one should be, because you're very engaged, and it comes through in your work how these tragedies have affected you. But then I think maybe this other sculptor wasn't doing it wrong. It's just too huge a topic, the Great War. How do you wrap your mind around that? So
And the
I was
Great
gonna
War.
ask you, how important do you think it is for a sculptor to know their subject, their commission, the story of the individual or the phenomenon?
I think it's extremely important, and I think it's only going to benefit the work if you can identify passions or feelings that you have about the context of the work. Now, when you've heard of the Great War, is that World War I? The Great War, anybody who knows anything about that war and how things changed, and the horrifying experience that must have been the lives of these men at that time, who would charge into machine gun fire, knowing the likelihood that they would be torn apart. Actually, I'm old enough to have my uncle was a World War I veteran, and I remember him. Time perspective on things. I think that, I mean, the point, I'm really glad this has taken this direction, this thread, because there are so many cliches about what we as artists do and what we feel, and I'm hoping that finally this idea that art is self-expression is kind of, it's not that it doesn't have some aspect of that, but primary roles of art in human life seem to shift. For example, at the time of the Enlightenment, art was primarily decoration, and 20th century was primarily self-expression, and I think it's becoming now other, having to do with personal and social transformation, in my opinion. But I think this level of sensitivity that we sort of naturally have as artists, we can almost, akin to a stage performer, channel those sensitivities to the purpose of the work of art. I'm going to make an analogy. You were talking about beginning the process of having anatomy study here, which I say, do it. It was one of the best things I ever did in my preparations as an artist, to have a year, well, a semester, with the medical students as part of their gross anatomy class. But then I took year after year after year, semester after semester, students on field trips in San Francisco to the anatomy lab. So that experience, the first time you go into a room full of bodies, is, that will take your breath away, literally and figuratively. Then you start to fine-tune your sensitivities and say, well, I'm not going to get sick over this. Okay, I'm not going to get sick. I'm not going to get sick. And I'm not going to be overwhelmed in my emotions about death. You steel yourself there. It's a kind of, sublimation of your feeling state. But then, and it's not just at that moment that you're experiencing it, you will remember it, and you can be flooded with feelings about that. And I think one of the skills we develop as artists is not just our motor skills. The skills we develop have to do with the refinement of our sensibilities. Feelings is too simplistic a word for it. Of our intuitions, of our creative wanderings and things like that. I don't think that any artist in history would have thought any differently about that, honestly. There's, as I said, there's always the next work, our curiosity, our expectation. And we need the skills in order to put these things into material, in order to embody the material with what's going on in our heads. So expression is not a worthless concept either, don't get me wrong. I just think it was overwrought in the 20th century.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more.
Yes, I'll stick around. I mean, I know it's 7:30, it's officially the end. Yes.
I'm always interested in the space that the sculpture needs to go into.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you're creating these sculptures in your own studio, and then if the space that you're creating the sculpture for is far away, like how do you figure that out? Because, I'm thinking of painting. When I'm trying to work on a painting, I'm always stepping back from it,
Mm-hmm.
looking around, trying to look at the light, different lighting conditions. But you have to be aware of not only the light, but the three-dimensional creation that you're making, and then the space in which it's viewed.
Absolutely.
So
You do sculpture?
how do you go about doing that?
You do a lot of work in your mind, in your imagination. I have a very small studio. It's similar to what they used to call a cube house in the Revolutionary War era in Virginia. People were claiming property just by building a house, but they were 18 feet by 18 feet by 18 feet with a peaked roof. So I got a great tall ceiling, but it's not enough storage space. So I bump into things all the time. I can't get back very far from my work, but I have to imagine what it's going to be like. And if you can visit the site, so much the better. If you can't, get some information about it, some visual information about it. But the best is to become familiar with the site. That's ideal. But then when you're actually making it, you can't certainly always duplicate the site, so you have to live a lot in your imagination. How will this look in sunlight? How will this look in overcast light? What direction is the sun going to be coming from? And
Yeah,
what's in the background and things like that.
So that you know how the sun is going to hit it at different times of the day and how you position it. And do you ever change your mind when you get on site before you install it?
I haven't had that experience yet. I hope by that time, when all the concrete is poured and things, you don't want to change your mind.
You have somebody else do all that before you would arrive for the installation?
Oh yeah. There has to be something in place where a sculpture can be secured. So there's a lot of permanent work that's done. Now all those decisions have to be well in place before that point.
Okay.
Yeah. You don't want to change your mind at the last minute on it.
I wouldn't think so.
Right.
That's all, sorry.
No, that's right.
What's the average length of a piece that you're working on? You had mentioned one had taken 3 months, but then the process had taken 5 years. Do you have multiple projects going on at one time?
I have multiple projects going on, and with projects that can go on for years, there is overlap. And it also is a function of how's the economy doing at that time. Back in 2012 and 2013, I thought I was going to go out of business. And the last few years have just been gangbusters for me. So you strike while the iron is hot. The average length of time, the bureaucracy in that San Francisco statue project took most of the time. Also, the last one that I showed you with the prayer walk, that had, you wouldn't believe this, it's a very small church, but an immense amount of politics where half of this project's time, which is almost 5 years, was taken up by people trying to block the project. So there's no single answer to that. If you want to say a life-size statue project should take about 9 months to a year, if no one's impeding it. Yes?
I'm really encouraged by your passion about those who have died under the hand of communism. And I've always been bothered by the fact there seems to be a lack of memorial or representation or education out there for those who died under that evil doctrine. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I have an answer for that, but first I'll say, maybe I didn't explain that, but in Washington, D.C., that is the Victims of Communism Memorial. That's what that is. And they're about to build a museum, like the Holocaust Museum.
Like the Holocaust Museum, yeah.
And with lots of personal testimony and journalistic
I think that's
documentation
great.
of things. I was very privileged to attend a lecture by a professor, actually coincidentally from Ukraine, about 5 years ago. Professor Marianovich is his name, and his thesis was that this ambivalence toward what has been, by far the most brutal and numbers of deaths system of the 20th century, is because and you compare it to Nazism. Nazism was properly and roundly morally condemned when it fell. Properly morally condemned. Communism was not. only in certain circles. There was still, think of well-meaning people from the 1930s in the United States who supported Stalin, industrialists who supported Stalin. They thought this, this is the compassionate system of the future. And even, I remember in the 60s, journalists who, I'll give you one, Barbara Tuchman, for example, who was waxing eloquently about Mao Zedong. They didn't want to admit that really these dictators killed millions and millions of people. So there was an ambivalence in the academic community about communism that didn't happen with Nazism. So his thesis, Professor Marjanovich's thesis, was it needs to be condemned in the same way that Nazism was condemned.
Yeah, I agree, and I commend, Jewish people who build Holocaust
Absolutely.
museums because we have such short memories.
Absolutely.
But I don't see the same thing happening in such a scale
Yeah.
for those who have died under communism.
Yes.
With that number of 100 million dead
Yes.
in the Black Book of Communism,
Right. That's where
both
it's from.
authors have actually backed away from that book since it was printed, and the editor, they claimed, had fudged the numbers wildly, and also was attempting through the book, through his ideology, that communism was responsible for 100 million deaths, that that basically it was just like Nazism, this horseshoe effect,
Mm-hmm.
that it was more or less the inverse of this other evil, and in effect was evil itself. And I think it's amazing the amount of denial in this country, for instance, with 100 million indigenous, peoples of this country being wiped out, as well as the democratic capitalist project since the 1940s in India, which has actually killed more than 100 million. People are still dying from famine. Farmers who are losing their land to international banking, and as well as other farming corporations that are taking their land and controlling their seed, as well as 300 years of slavery in this country. My point is that I think, all these experiments in terms of systems of governance are very difficult I think they're all very convoluted in the sense that when you're attempting to display that one thing, some people say that this government that we're in right now isn't really a real capitalism. It's not the ideal capitalism that they have in their mind. As far as I understand, the Soviets, the anti-fascists, actually won World War II. It wasn't America, but it was actually the Soviet Union that had killed more Nazis than America coming in at the very end. And I respect them for that. The Black Book of Communism counts the dead Nazis as victims of the communists. I wildly disagree with that because I'm not a Nazi or extreme far right sympathizer. As a communist, personally, I would disagree with Tiananmen Square. I think the voices of those students were very important to the broader context of what freedom is, as well as a party that had turned their back on its people, on its workers. Everybody probably in this room has an iPhone, and Communist China is a part of the division of labor when we're talking about international capitalism. They're the second world. Third world would be Africa, and they're actually in the mines digging these raw materials. Many of those people don't actually have the ability to afford the goods. And then in the second world, there is a middle class, like in Communist China now, there is a middle class that is coming up because of reforms they've made, to compromise with a free market in their society. And they can afford the sweatshop labor of their own workers. But, I mean, I think it's very complicated. I think the ideal of looking forward to a world where everybody is fed, everybody has access to education, nobody struggles in poverty. Even if it fails, as an artist, I'm constantly met with failure as an opportunity. Now, hopefully I don't starve to death in that struggle. But when I'm thinking about the broader context of the materials that are available on the planet, and I'm thinking about the planet as a whole, I'm thinking I could be very resentful about the ruling class, or about the fact that since my lifetime we have a new estate in the world, which is, billionaires. We have a new estate in the world of wealth. We have billionaires. Before I was born, they didn't even exist. And I had to grow up with people thinking they were some of the coolest people ever. I mean, that they were actually going to save the world. Now that's started to change. People are actually starting to think the opposite, especially the kinds of technology that are coming out and the vulnerability people have felt through the social relationships, right, that they've become very intimate with through social media, through Facebook, through do you even own the material that you put on there? No. How's it being used? When you go and check your family history, how is that being used? Will there be clones made from the blood that's collected from your body? Do you have any control over any of this stuff? Putting a price on everything. I think if we consider global warming, we'd have to say it wasn't a future catastrophe of environmental collapse wouldn't be a discussion about communism, it would be a discussion about capitalism. And it's just very complicated. I would side with communism, but of course I wouldn't side with a dictatorship. That's a transition. We've only actually experienced communism, in its social war.
Could I suggest something?
It hasn't been able to create its conditions.
Could I suggest something here?
Yeah, please.
That as an artist, when you see something that you believe, you perceive and believe in your heart is an injustice, that's the subject for you to deal with in this art and the role of personal and social transformation. I think that it would be, as greater consciousness is happening of the atrocities that were done to Native Americans, I think that there's room for a lot more monuments there. I think there are certainly, and it is happening, certainly room for monuments to the horrors of slavery, not just in the United States, but in any country that used it. These are, so we may not all agree on what is a significant injustice, but that is often a very important subject matter. I might add that if you want some documentary material on those things from the Black Book, that has not been a discredited book. There's some skepticism maybe that you're pointing out, but here's an author of a Chinese journalist. His last name is Liu, Liu, Binyan, Binyan, and he well documented the 60 million who were starved by Mao. And another named Jasper Becker, a British writer, wrote a book called Hungry Ghosts. I would just ask that you read things by these writers if you have any questions about the veracity of Mao's starvation campaign. Now, whether Stalin killed 30 million or 12 million, it's a vast number, mostly of people in Ukraine and kulaks, landowning serfs who were starved in those campaigns. This is not really open to question. Those are historical facts. Now, the numbers you might debate. I would just suggest that if you perceive an injustice, that could be a great subject matter for your work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't attempt to defend any of those famines or tragedies.
Yeah.
Just that everything from the Dark Ages, when the Catholic Church more or less ruled, to even Tian rebellion in China when they attempted There was Mr. Hong, who claimed he was the brother of Jesus, and there was that debacle where something like 20 or 30 million people died in China. And they attempted actually a democracy. They'd actually attempted a democracy and went up against the dynasty at that time. I don't know. It's a mess. It's a mess. But I think there's just plenty of them.
I hope that you will pick the ones that are meaningful to you and create some beautiful works of art that speak to people.
I really appreciate your attempt to approach such huge, tremendous moments in history, and attempt to use your art as
Thank you.
yeah.
Any other thing before we wrap up?